This current US administration has adopted a stance of protectionist and borderline isolationist policies. This is in order to follow through with an election promise to put America first. I would argue these efforts lead to a less than advantageous position for a nation that has people on both sides of the aisle desperate for some change. This analysis will be based entirely on strategic importance. So the best move strategically, not right or wrong, not left or right, not anything related to any identity politics. It's going to be based exclusively on the best strategic move the US could make in any given situation. So in this video, I'll provide 4 examples of America First policies that could have the potential to backfire on the nation significantly.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
The first example is the significant cuts made to USAID.
USAID workers cleared their workspaces today as the agency that provides humanitarian aid overseas gets dismantled. It comes as the Trump administration announces plans for much bigger cuts to the federal workforce. Natalie Brand reports from the White House.
Supporters clapped as former USAID employees collected their belongings from the agency's now closed Washington headquarters. The moment brought some to tears.
Usually USAID is applied to third world countries or countries that are experiencing some type of natural disaster, any type of situation where they need funds, aid from other countries. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio recently cut 85% of the projects that USAID was working on. Since the beginning of this administration, billions of dollars have been cut in funding for USAID.
CBS News has confirmed a nearly 90% cut in foreign aid contracts, totaling nearly $60 billion.
Now, when you first think about it, it makes sense. The US is $37 trillion in debt. Are we really in a position to help anyone at this point? Can we be this caring nation that's constantly giving away aid to other countries in need? Or are we putting ourselves in a dangerous situation where we could end up becoming a less than wealthy country in the future? I would argue the USAID program was not just a feel-good program. It wasn't a charity organization. There was some strategic value to it. The best example of this would probably be Zanzaneo, which was a Cuban social media project.
What would happen if the U.S. government used social media to undermine a hostile foreign government? That may be exactly what the U.S. Agency for International Development tried to do in Cuba with Zunzuneo, a Twitter-style social media platform secretly controlled by the U.S. government.
That was launched using funds from USAID that were supposedly going to humanitarian efforts in Pakistan. But this provided an opportunity for the US government to launch a social media platform in Cuba that could stir up an uprising and potentially remove the problematic government in that country, which would allow the US to get closer to that country and reestablish relations. It would boost the economy of both nations. Obviously, that's in the best interest of the US. So it makes sense to go with that mission, that covert mission to launch this social media platform. And USAID provided the opportunity to hide the funds for that as humanitarian aid. So from a strategic standpoint, there was some value to this USAID program. And this isn't the only example. There are plenty of examples where USAID funding was used to even blackmail countries into acting in a certain way that's advantageous to the US or risk having their funding cut.
I like the message that Nikki sent yesterday at the United Nations. For all of these nations that take our money and then they vote against us at the Security Council, or they vote against us potentially at the Assembly. They take hundreds of millions of dollars and even billions of dollars, and then they vote against us. Well, we're watching those votes. Let them vote against us. We'll save a lot.
For example, after the Arab Spring in 2011, Egypt has had its humanitarian aid from USAID kind of restricted and pulled back whenever they act in a way that's not aligning with the interests of the US, whether that's an anti-democratic way or being an enemy of Israel, anything that conflicts with US interests, they risk their aid. So USAID provides the US government the ability to control the actions of third world countries and other, smaller nations without having to resort to military tactics. It's a very useful strategic tool.
Trump and the King of Jordan there in the Oval, other cabinet members, Trump making his demand pretty clear. Take in more Palestinians or say goodbye to U.S. aid.
So basically, USAID allows the U.S. to gain goodwill by giving away this aid, while also being able to use that program to launch more covert operations and control the actions of other nations. So you improve your image and gain strategic value.
For 60 years, this bag has served as the symbol for the United States Food for Peace program.
Now we can move on to the second example, which is the weakening of international alliances like NATO and the UN. The current administration has spotted a problem which has been going on for decades, that the US is disproportionately bearing the burden of NATO, with all the other countries failing to meet their military funding goals.
Yeah, Peter?
Well, so why stay in NATO at all?
I view NATO as potentially good, but you gotta get some good thinking in NATO. It's very unfair what's been happening. Until I came along, we were paying close to 100% of NATO. So think of it, we're paying 100% of their military, and they're screwing us on trade.
So these countries are basically relying on the US for protection while using their tax money to improve the lives of their citizens and just make their country better overall, while the US has to bear this burden. So when you think of it that way, it makes sense to cut all ties with NATO or severely restrict the involvement of the US until these countries are willing to meet their obligations. However, when you look at it from a historical context, going all the way back to the Bretton Woods Conference.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt to the first major world financial meeting since the London Conference of 1933, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort.
Joining this order for any country other than the United States meant the following three things. 1. You would fix the value of your currency to the US dollar, which itself was tied to gold. 2. You would rely on the US for military protection, potentially even hosting US military bases. And 3. The US would help your industries become competitive against their own by providing Marshall Plan 8 and by opening up its own market, while allowing its recovering allies to shield their markets to a certain extent from US companies.
This situation allowed the US to grow to the size that it is now. It's a massive country with influence on the entire world, the clear #1 superpower, and as a result it has a large influence on Europe, and you can see that in the current Ukraine and Russia conflict, where the US has more say than the largest European countries.
US President Donald Trump says there's a good chance he will meet with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, raising hopes of a potential breakthrough in ceasefire negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Talk of a face-to-face summit followed a 3-hour meeting between US envoy Steve Witkoff and President Putin in Moscow today.
And I think this is where the risk becomes apparent. If we give up this leadership role in these alliances and we sacrifice our place in the world as it is now, we don't know if in another stance if the US would still be as successful. We only know the success of the US in this current situation. If you go back before the Bretton Woods Conference and before World War II, the US was not as dominant as it is now. It was a growing nation, it was a strong nation, but it blew up now to the point where it's the most powerful country in the history of the world. Now, can that success be sustained without these alliances and without this influence on other countries? That's yet to be seen. These alliances also allow for the US to move military assets to other countries closer to an adversary nation. For example, in the recent strikes in Iran, there were many military assets that were moved to the Middle East and to friendly nations in Europe that let the US launch an attack very quickly. And those types of capabilities wouldn't exist if it wasn't for these agreements. So an additional cost for the US leaving these alliances could be the loss of the ability to launch an attack at a moment's notice. And we might be restricting our military's capabilities at that point. Now, this is a perfect segue to the third example, which is the tariffs that we're launching on strategic allies. So nations like India, Canada, countries that we've basically been trying to foster good relations with for a long time, and these tariffs are harming that situation. The justification for these tariffs comes from the Bretton Woods Agreement that was previously discussed. Most countries have unfair tariffs on the US. If you compare the tariffs we have against them, their tariffs are usually higher for a reason. That's just the way the world has worked. They can't compete with US companies in any other situation. But the cost of these tariffs could even be greater than the loss of alliances like NATO. For example, the 50% tariffs that have been recently placed on India has pushed India back into the arms of China, which they had a long-standing conflict with.
India's Prime Minister is in China for the first time in 7 years as he attends a regional economic and security forum. Narendra Modi and China's President Xi Jinping met ahead of the opening of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Tianjin. At least 19 other leaders are attending the talks, including Russia, Turkey, North Korea and Pakistan. During their meeting, Modi told Xi that New Delhi was committed to improving ties with Beijing. The bilateral talks come just days after the US imposed 50% tariffs on Indian goods.
It's the exact opposite direction that the US would want to go in strategically. India is the best ally for the US to counter China, a nation with an equal population, a fast-growing economy, and a large military that can be boosted with US aid to face China in a scenario where they're in a conflict. This need for an ally large enough to challenge China is why the US invested decades into this relationship with India. You can see examples like when the US warned India of an incoming Chinese attack at their border when they were having border interactions. You can see that the US picked sides in this conflict and they're hoping to build up their relationship with India in order to counter China in a future conflict. Now these tariffs have made the relationship between the US and India more and more contentious, and it doesn't look like it's going to improve in the near future. Another significant impact of these tariffs is the reciprocal tariffs that other countries are applying and the ongoing trade war and the impact it's having on industries in the US that rely a lot on exports like agriculture and specifically soybeans.
The United States is one of the world's leading soybean producers.
My husband Mark and I, we farm soybeans and corn along the Missouri River in northern Missouri.
Farms across the country produced about 4.3 billion bushels of soybeans in 2022, and the entire soybean sector contributed an average $124 billion to the U.S. economy since 2019.
The soybean market is the perfect example of this. China is no longer buying their soybeans from the U.S. since the prices are too high once you add the tariffs in, so they're buying cheaper soybeans from Brazil, which is the largest soybean producer in the world. So they're taking up most of the export market, and now the American farmers are dumping their soybeans into the domestic market, which is making the prices plummet. So smaller farms that might be in the same industry aren't able to compete, and they can't sustain their farm because of the low prices. So their input costs are the same, but the prices have dropped, so they're not making any profit. From what I've seen while doing some research, it seems like Arkansas farmers have been hit the hardest, and people are projecting that 1/4 to 1/3 of Arkansas farmers could be potentially out of business by this time next year. This just shows that there might be some justification for these tariffs and reciprocal tariffs on countries, that have higher tariff on us. There could be some unintended consequences from that we need to consider to pick the best strategic opportunity for the country.
September's upon us, harvest is starting in the deep south, and we have 0 bushels of soybeans on the books to be sold to China for this current crop that's about to come out of the field. Historically, over the last 5 years, about 1/3 of soybean sales to China would be booked. China amounts to 25% of our total U.S. soybean crop. So that would be 8 or 9% of the whole U.S. crop would normally be on the books with China right now, and we have 0. That is alarming.
This was his 39th harvest, and he has never seen it as bad as this.
And I've never been as worried as I am now about whether or not my kids and grandkids will be able to carry on.
For King, the main problem starts with the fact that they can't sell for profit.
I just would like to see somebody help us get our markets back. We need our exports, and we just need to be paid for what we do. And that's not happening. And we're in real trouble.
And the last example is limiting legal immigration. I think we can all agree that illegal immigration is a problem, because it's just, you gotta have a record of people have to come into this country legally. There's no question about that. Now, you can debate whether or not all the illegal immigrants should be kicked out. That's not relevant to this conversation. But legal immigration is very valuable to the US, and that's not really debatable. Legal immigration is the thing protecting the US from population decline, which other wealthy nations are facing all over the world. And it's also a resource in terms of brain drain and brain gain. So basically the US is draining brain power from other countries by taking their educated professionals, their experienced professionals, people who have been trained and made a living for themselves in their country, They're the best and the brightest in their country. They're a smaller nation, and they come to the US. So the US gains that expertise while also weakening that nation.
Rich countries that are desirable destinations to live and work will get their pick of skilled young workers who want to move there to start a better life. Most advanced countries can pick how many skilled workers they want to enter their economy simply by increasing or decreasing the amount of skilled worker visas they give out.
So the US is able to grow stronger and grow economically while taking the brainpower from potential adversaries or even non-adversarial countries, while those countries are losing the ability to compete with the US. So basically, legal immigration and brain drain is the best strategy to keep the US ahead indefinitely. These other countries can't catch up or can't develop enough to compete if their best brain power, their best people are being taken, they're willingly leaving the country and coming to the US. It's beneficial for the US exclusively. There are statistics that show, 35% of Nobel Prize winners were immigrants. In strategic industries like semiconductors, 34% of the patents were written by immigrants. So there's clearly a brain gain happening for the US by taking all the professionals from these other countries. So basically, the best way to summarize this is that, especially when it comes to foreign policy, the US does everything for a reason. It's not just to be good or politically correct. There are strategic advantages from everything, really, if you think about it. Whether it's foreign aid, whether it's alliances like NATO, there is a gain for the US, and that's why it's been going on for so long. And when you start to strip away these programs, then you start to see the potential losses strategically. So I think it's worth considering, what strategic advantages are we giving up when we're getting rid of any program? I think the best way to pursue a real America First policy would be to look into how to improve the quality of life of regular Americans and protect them from greedy corporations or financial theft, financial fraud, which is taking over this country completely right now. Basically just improve how people are living in this country. But let me know what you think below of the 4 points that were made, and if you think the gains from removing these programs outweighs the risk of losing the strategic advantage gained from these programs. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.